choux pastry, I'm going to start by putting 150 millilitres of water into a saucepan, and although I've used a measuring jug, I actually weighed it because that's more accurate than the measurements on the measuring jug. And so 150 ml of water and 60 grams, oops, that splashed a little bit, of butter. So I'm going to turn the hob on. So what I'm wanting to do is to melt the butter, and then the water should come to the boil. Just going to stir the butter as it's heating, because I want to make sure that that butter has melted before the water comes to the boil. Just going to lift it off the heat so that the butter can start to melt in the warmth of the water. So my butter has almost melted. And just before it melts, I'm going to add a pinch of salt, because it's unsalted butter I've used, so to help bring flavour out of the pastry, it needs a little bit of salt. Now this is starting to come to a rapid boil. The butter has totally melted and the liquid is bubbling. So I don't want it to boil too much. I'm going to lift the pan off the heat and tip in 75 grams of strong plain flour. And then that needs to be beaten well. So when I've beaten it, the flour, the starch grains swell up and absorb the liquid and the fat. So that's gelatinisation of the starch grains. So I'm just cooking it just for about a minute, just to cook that starch. Then I'm going to turn the heat off, and I'm going to take that off the hob and leave it to cool just for a few minutes before I add the egg. Don't forget, if you don't have a heat-proof work surface, put it down on a trivet or something to protect your work surface. Now my eggs, I need 2 medium-sized eggs, and I'm going to crack them into a bowl and beat them lightly with a fork. But if I were to add those eggs to my flour mixture now, that's so hot it would cook the eggs and I would end up with like scrambled eggs in it. So I need to leave it to cool for a few minutes before I beat in the egg. So once this mixture has cooled a little bit, I'm going to add some of the beaten egg. And then I want to beat it really well, and this will incorporate some air into the mixture. You can do this with an electric whisk if you want to, but to save washing up, most of the time I just do it by hand. So when that beaten egg has gone in smoothly, you can add a little bit more and then beat that in. So you need to add the egg in 3 or 4 lots, not all at once. And And I want it to be a paste consistency of a sort of soft dropping consistency. So you don't have to add all the egg. This one is going to take it all. So now beat that last bit of egg in. Right, that is looking a good consistency now. Sort of with a little shake, it will drop off the spoon. Now, you can put this onto the baking tray. You can pipe it as eclairs or profiteroles, or you could use a couple of teaspoons to put little balls of the mixture on if you don't have a piping tube. If you've got a piping tube, you can use a star-shaped one or a plain one. I'm using a 1 centimetre diameter plain tube, and I'm going to cut the end off the piping bag and put the tube into it, and then I'm going to twist the bag and I'm going to stick it in a vase. Now this vase will hold the bag open while I put the mixture in, and because I've twisted it, the mixture won't just go straight through and come out into the vase. If you don't have a vase, you could use a tall measuring jug or any container, perhaps a spaghetti container that's that size, or if you don't have anything at all, you can do it over your hand, but it's slightly more difficult to do it that way. So I find it easier to have a vase ready for it. So I'm going to get all that mixture into the bag. Scraping out as much of it as you can. You don't want to waste any mixture. Then you could start twisting from the top, and that's the bag ready to use. So I'm going to do this as profiteroles. So I'm going to keep that well twisted so I don't have the mixture squirting out that end of the tube, and I'm going to press small balls onto the baking sheet. And if you have little points on them, don't worry too much. I've got a bowl of cold water. I'm going to wet my finger and then just press the points down. So that will help give them a slightly better shape. Sometimes it looks nice to have points on the pastry, but they can burn, so I tend to press them down again. If you want to do eclairs, you can just pipe a line of the paste and stop squeezing, or you can pipe it and then use a small knife to cut it off to give you a nice even length. So that one, I'm going to press the end back to make it neater. If you're doing these, you need to do them on a lined baking sheet. I've got a silicone liner here which is reusable, otherwise you can do it onto baking parchment. And if I were doing eclairs, what I would do is on the back of the baking parchment I would draw 2 parallel lines with pencil, and then when you pipe these you can make sure they're all exactly the same length. But for this recipe I want to actually have more profiteroles, so I'm going to go back to piping the ball shapes. Okay, so to help the choux puff up, I find it helps to spray a little bit of water onto them. If you don't have a spray, you can just put a few drips of water on between them with your fingers. And then what I'm going to do is put these into the oven and spray some water around to make it a little bit steamy in there. So the oven is on 200 degrees centigrade and they'll take about 15 to 20 minutes. So once the timer goes, I'm going to take these out of the oven. So they're looking a really good colour at the moment and working fairly quickly. What I'm going to do is pierce, using a knife, a little hole in each of them, or you could use a skewer or a cocktail stick to do this, because you just need a tiny hole, and that lets the steam escape, and then we'll pop them back in the oven for just a few more minutes to dry them out. There we are, I think I've done them all. So I'm going to pop them back in the oven just for another 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, so these should be ready now. They should feel nice and crisp. So that they cool quickly, I'm going to transfer them onto a wire rack. If you leave them to cool on the baking sheet, sometimes the bottom of them can go a little bit soggy. So they are quite hot. You might find it easier to use a palette knife, and they should just sort of roll off. Just make sure that none of them roll onto the floor. Now they need to be left to cool, and then I can fill them with cream and put chocolate sauce on them. To make chocolate sauce, I'm going to put into the saucepan 100 millilitres of water, and I'm going to add to that 60 grams of butter. I'm going to turn it on, and then I want to melt the butter. So I've got it on a fairly high heat while it's melting the butter. The water's got very hot, so I'm just taking the pan off and I'm stirring it while the rest of the butter melts. Now what I'm going to add to the pan is 175 grams of muscovado sugar. This is light muscovado sugar. You can either use light or dark. And then to make it a chocolatey sauce and to give it a nice dark colour, I'm going to add 2 level tablespoons of cocoa powder. I'm going to reduce the temperature, the heat on this a little. And I've just taken it off the heat while I'm letting the sugar dissolve and the cocoa dissolve into it. And then I'm going to let it simmer for a few minutes. In this bowl, I've got a 300 millilitre carton of whipping cream, and I'm going to whip it with the electric whisk. You can do it with a hand whisk if you want to. The important thing to remember is not to over whisk it. If you over whisk it, then it will separate. It's almost like you've made butter, and once you've got to that stage, there's nothing you can do. This recipe for profiteroles, because I'm using fresh cream, once you fill them, it needs to be kept refrigerated. You shouldn't have anything with fresh cream out of refrigeration for more than 2 hours. But I always find profiteroles are the best when they're freshly filled anyway, because the pastry stays a little bit crisper. If you're wanting a filling to sit out of the fridge for a long time, you can make a buttercream like an Italian meringue buttercream or Swiss meringue buttercream and use that as a filling. So the cream needs to be really well chilled. So the cream needs to be really well chilled, otherwise it won't whip properly. It's starting to thicken, so I'm just turning the speed of it down a little bit. Okay, that's done enough now. It will just leave a shape when I lift the whisk out of the cream. So in this piping bag, I've got a filling tube, which is a long, narrow piping tube. And it's designed for filling things like profiteroles or donuts. If you don't have one of these, don't worry, it's not essential. What you can do is you can use even a normal plastic bag, a food bag, a rectangular one, and just cut off the corner of it, and you can take your profiterole, cut it open, and then pipe some cream into it, or you can use a plain or a star piping tube on the end of it. You don't have to have one of these, this just makes it a little bit easier if you do have one. So I'm opening it out over my hand, and then I'm going to spoon some cream into it. Now it's a little bit of a two-stage thing with the piping tube. If you just press it in, well, that's what I cut, then all that happens is that moves back into the cream. What you need to do is to hold the piping tube, then press it in, and then squeeze it to fill it with some cream. And then take it out. So you can see that's got some cream in there. If you do put too much, just wipe it off, and you can push it on your plate and wipe your finger off before doing the next one. So going to press the tube in and squeeze some of the cream in, stop squeezing and take it out. I've got one layer of profiteroles on my serving plate. I'm going to take my sauce, give it a little stir, and then drizzle over some of this sauce. I really like this recipe because it gives a nice glossy chocolate sauce. Then I'm going to continue filling them to put some on top. Once they're all piled up, you can then drizzle over a little bit more sauce. So I've put sauce between each of the layers. Just to stick them together as I was assembling them. And then if you've got any extra sauce, you can serve that in a little jug or a little bowl to go with them.